Hi guys, Claudia here, and today we're going to be talking about the 10th of May 1536. So as I warned you yesterday, today we're going to be talking about some of the charges against Anne and George. So we're going to be looking at one particular document called the Middlesex Indictment. So indictment just means a formal charge or accusation of a serious crime, and it's called the Middlesex Indictment because this is decided upon by the Grand Jury of Middlesex. So as I said yesterday, the foreman of this jury is a man called Giles Heron. He is the son-in-law of Thomas More. He has no reason to be kind or fair to Anne or George. This is his jury of hand-picked men, and these are the charges that together they have come up with, and they've drawn them up into a document. So what I'm going to do today is I'm actually going to read you this indictment, and it's quite unpleasant, and I personally find it really quite emotional and difficult to get through. I think at this point in studying it and going through the documents, it starts to feel more horrific and more real. So obviously, because this is written in Tudor English, it's a bit heavy to read all in one. So I'm going to read you bit by bit. It's not too long a document, don't worry. And I'm going to go through what they mean and just pick out some language which I think is particularly interesting. So it begins, indictment found at Westminster on Wednesday next, after 3 weeks of Easter, and then it just lists all the men on the jury. And it says that these men present that whereas Queen Anne has been the wife of Henry VIII for 3 years and more, she, despising her marriage and entertaining malice against the king, and following daily her frail and carnal lust, did falsely and traitorously procure by base conversations and kisses, touchings, gifts, and other infamous incitations, divers of the king's daily and familiar servants, to be her adulterers and concubines. So that several of the king's servants yielded to her vile provocations on the 6th of October at Westminster, and divers days before and after. So already this is heavily biased. We have, and she despising her marriage and entertaining malice against the king. They're already setting Anne up as that wicked woman, that wicked queen archetype, and following daily her frail and carnal lust. So another way they're trying to destroy Anne and her reputation is to imply that she had this incredible lust. She was so promiscuous. Again, I'll remind you that the vast majority of historians do think she was innocent of that anyway. But it is interesting to see how little times have changed since the Tudor era. If we look at the ways they seek to bring down a woman, if they can present her as being sexual, then she is considered to be evil. A woman is not supposed to have this carnal lust. Now, of course, in this case, Anne didn't have this carnal lust. This is completely made up to ruin her reputation. But it is so interesting to me that that is the way that they would ruin a woman's reputation then. That's one of their tactics, to paint her as immoral and ungodly, and we do still see that today. It says she did falsely and traitorously procure. So again, she hasn't even been to trial yet, and in this indictment they are already declaring her as traitorously procuring, so she is already a traitor in their eyes. They speak of her procuring lovers and other infamous incitations. So again, it's this idea of this wicked, evil sexual woman manipulating the men around her, using her terrible sexual energy to draw them into this situation. It says several of the king's servants yielded to her vile provocations. I mean, it's utterly ridiculous. They are acting like Anne was seducing her entire court, all the men of court, right in front of everyone. Okay, so then it addresses the charges with regard to each man in particular. It's interesting that Richard Page and Thomas Wyatt are not part of these charges. Although they're in the Tower, they seem to have got out of it. And as I spoke about in a previous video, it would seem to be that that's because Thomas Wyatt's family is quite close to Cromwell. So as for Henry Norris, she procured by sweet words, kisses, touches and otherwise Henry Norris of Westminster, gentleman of the Privy Chamber, to violate her, by reason whereof he did so at Westminster on the 12th of October. And they had illicit intercourse various other times, both before and after, sometimes by his procurement and sometimes by that of the Queen. So although Anne is being painted as the ultimate villain here, the wicked seductress, they don't want the men to get away with it either. So it's notable here that they say that sometimes by her procurement and sometimes by his. So in a later video I'm going to talk to you about some of these charges and how most of them can be proved completely false anyway, because the people involved weren't even in the places they are supposed to have been in this indictment. Okay, so now we're moving on to George, and this one really upsets me. Also the Queen, on the 2nd of November, and several times before and after at Westminster, procured and incited her own natural brother George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, gentleman of the Privy Chamber, to violate her, alluring him with her tongue in the said George's mouth, and the said George's tongue in hers, and also with kisses, presents, and jewels, whereby he, despising the commands of God and all human laws, violated and carnally knew the said Queen, his own sister, at Westminster, which he also did on divers other days before and after at the same place, sometimes by his own procurement and sometimes by the Queen's. This is upsetting because this is designed to shock. It's deliberately explicit. This is made to humiliate the Boleyn siblings. I mean, it's so unnecessarily graphic to create an emotional response in the people that hear it. So alluring him with her tongue in the said George's mouth and the said George's tongue in hers. The idea is that they want people to think that Boleyn siblings are despicable. They have to emotionally and instinctively get people to stand against them. Because if anyone looks at the information properly, they are bound to see that these charges are almost entirely false. It says, whereby he, despising the commands of God and all human laws. And this would have been such an insult to George, because as we know, George was a dedicated reformer. This was his religion, this was his life, these were his politics. And yet here they say he despises the command of God. People reading this will be absolutely horrified, and this is another tactic to silence George. They know George is a loose cannon. They know he's going to stand up for himself very well at trial. So they need to make sure that by the time he gets there, people are already set against him and they think he is a terrible, terrible person. We then have William Brereton, also the Queen, on the 3rd of December and divers days before and after at Westminster, procured one William Brereton, late of Westminster, gentleman of the Privy Chamber, to violate her, whereby he did so on the 8th of December at Hampton Court, in the parish of Littlehampton, and on several other days before and after, sometimes by his own procurement and sometimes by the Queen's. Again, William Brereton is someone that they want to get rid of, so it's important that it says that sometimes it was by his procurement. Also the Queen, on the 8th of May, and at other times before and since, procured Sir Francis Weston of Westminster, gentleman of the Privy Chamber, whereby he did so on the 20th of May. Also the Queen, on the 12th of April, and divers days before and since at Westminster, procured Mark Smeaton, groom of the Privy Chamber, to violate her, whereby he did so at Westminster on the 26th of April. And again, you've got to feel sorry for Mark Smeaton, because he does not have the same protections that the other people that are accused have. He has been tortured because he is lower born. The indictment goes on to say, moreover, the said Lord Rochford, Norris, Brereton, Weston, and Smeaton, being thus inflamed with carnal love of the Queen, and having become very jealous of each other, gave her secret gifts and pledges while carrying on this illicit intercourse, and the Queen, on her part, could not endure any of them to converse with any other women, without showing great displeasure. And on the 27th of November, and other days before and after at Westminster, she gave them great gifts to encourage them in their crimes. So at this point, they're implying that Anne is running some sort of court sex cult. This is absolutely ludicrous. She is the Queen. She is being watched at all times. She is surrounded by ladies, by dignitaries, by emissaries. It's utterly ridiculous. This is not something that could possibly have happened. The court exists, circling around the King and the Queen. She's not some lady in waiting who can go off and do whatever she wants in private. Everyone is watching her all the time. It goes on to say, and further the said Queen and those other traitors on the 31st of October at Westminster conspired the death and destruction of the King, the Queen often saying that she would marry one of them as soon as the King died, and affirming that she would never love the King in her heart. And the King, having a short time since become aware of the said abominable crimes and treasons against himself, took such inward displeasure and heaviness, especially from his said Queen's malice and adultery, that certain harms and perils have befallen his royal body. Now they are adding the poor Henry angle. The stress of this situation is negatively impacting poor Henry. Now the idea of Anne conspiring for the death and destruction of the King Makes absolutely no sense at all. So as we've spoken about before, Anne is in a very precarious situation anyway. There are so many people at court who hate her and want her dead. The king is probably her only protection from this. Now, I spoke to you briefly in another video about the miscarriage that Anne had in January of 1536. They believe this fetus was male, and this is partly why a lot of people believe that Henry wanted to get rid of Anne in the first place. But the reason that Anne herself gave for this particular miscarriage is that prior to that, Henry had been involved in a terrible jousting accident. So you might have heard discussions about what made Henry VIII into the tyrant king and what changed his personality, and some people are of the opinion that it was in fact this fall and this jousting injury that gave him a head injury and started to change his personality over time. But his injury was so severe that he was left speechless for 2 hours, and that means that he was unconscious. So the King of England was unconscious for 2 hours. Now, when Anne was told about this, she went into a state of shock, and she later says that the way in which she was told this shocking news was part of the reason why she miscarried the child, because of the great terror and stress she felt. Anne knew that with Henry gone, there was no one there to protect her. There was no one there to protect Elizabeth and her family. There is no way that Anne would have been conspiring for the destruction of the king. It wouldn't have been in her interests. It would have put her in the most terrible danger. And last of all, it says, "And thus the said queen and the other traitors aforesaid have committed their treasons in contempt of the crown and of the issue and heirs of the said king and queen." So I think we can gather from this that these people's fates were already decided. They're already spoken about as traitors, as enemies of the crown. This is not so much an indictment as a manipulative, persuasive piece of character assassination. Now, also on the 10th of May, Sir William Kingston, who is Constable of the Tower, is asked to make arrangements for the upcoming trials. He is in fact ordered to bring up the bodies. So yes, that is where Hilary Mantel got that particular quote from. So it's decided that Brereton, Norris, Weston and Smeaton are all going to be tried on the 12th, but Anne and George are going to be tried on the 15th. Thank you for watching. I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Please keep safe and I love you loads. Bye!